My presentation is going to focus on two main things. First of all, I'm going to try in my own little way to characterize the current state of Caribbean economies and the uncertainties which we see in the external environment. I'll also try to speak to CDB's role in helping our borrowing member countries to build resilience against external shocks. Ladies and gentlemen, how would I characterize the state of Caribbean economies today? If we were to use the metric of economic growth, a simple and somewhat inadequate measure, we could say that 13 of the 19 borrowing member countries in CDB's membership, we would expect them to grow faster in 2016 than they did in 2015. But two of our stronger credits, that is Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, will experience negative growth in 2016. Interestingly, all of the services-dependent economies should grow, even if only marginally. This, as you would appreciate, is somewhat of a rebound from earlier years after the Great Recession. The two borrowing member countries whose economies are expected to contract are heavily commodity dependent and also represent a reversal of a trend which had emerged a few years ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, one could conclude that Caribbean economies are in something of a recovery mode, and in my view, that's fair comment, except that this recovery is occurring at a time of great uncertainty in what is emerging as a somewhat topsy-turvy external environment. These external threats include the possibility of economic weakening in Europe and in North America, at the same time that China's growth rate is slowing as that country addresses internal structural weaknesses. The threats also loom ominously in the shape of the correspondent bank de-risking crisis, which portends challenges for the movement of money into and out of Caribbean economies. In addition to these dark clouds, so to speak, is the ever-present threat to economic and social infrastructure posed by natural hazards and climate change, broadly defined. In the face of a surfeit of threats to economic stability and growth, it is not surprising, therefore, that the term sustainable is almost de rigueur in describing the menu of actions which need to be taken in managing Caribbean economies. So how has the Caribbean Development Bank been assisting our borrowing member countries to withstand or to build resilience to the myriad of threats? This morning, we will do an examination of our operations, which hopefully will give you a glimpse into the menu of our interventions which have taken place in 2015. It will illustrate the wide range of products which an institution like ours can deploy in support of a country's effort to build a more resilient and sustainable economic and social system. The judicious use of technical assistance grants, capital and policy loans, blended with our staff's many years of experience working in small island development states, enables the Caribbean Development Bank to partner with its BMCs to build resilience against a raft of different risks. In 2015, ladies and gentlemen, we approved 12 capital loans, 3 policy-based loans, and 62 technical assistance interventions. These approvals totaled $292 million, and when we speak at the CDB of dollars, we mean United States dollars. This is an increase from $270 million in 2014, and our total disbursements amounted to $160 million. Loans totaling $262 million were made to 10 countries, the largest beneficiaries being Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, and Grenada. Our operations in 2015 were directed towards long-term, inclusive, and sustainable growth. It was also targeted at good governance and the building of resilience. The bulk of the financing was targeted at investments to strengthen and modernize social and economic infrastructure, to improve environmental management and disaster risk management, to build climate resilience whilst promoting energy efficiency and renewable energy, and of course, to promote private sector development and improvements in governance broadly defined. Infrastructure development plays an important role in enhancing the business environment, in increasing access to employment opportunities for our people, and generally in reducing poverty. In the area of economic infrastructure, we approved 7 loans totaling $121 million, or 46%, almost half of our approvals. These projects included improving water supply in the Bahamas and right here in Barbados, upgrading the John Compton Dam in St. Lucia. It was targeted at flood mitigation, again here in Barbados, and rehabilitation and reconstruction of roads and sea defenses after severe damage from floods and Tropical Storm Erica in Dominica. 4 major interventions totaling $65 million were made to upgrade social infrastructure and included technical and vocational education training in St. Kitts and Nevis, 2 basic education projects in Belize and in Grenada, and 1 project to enhance the effectiveness and sustainability of the Student Revolving Loan Fund here again in our home country, Barbados. Noteworthy, ladies and gentlemen, was a grant of almost $13 million from the Caribbean Development Bank for technical and vocational education and training in Haiti. We are giving emphasis to the development of the education sector in Haiti because we believe that that is where most of the effort is needed at this particular point in time. The approved projects included components that provided for gender assessments, gender training, and improvements in other support systems for at-risk and vulnerable groups. This is part of our mandate as a development institution. Social and gender monitoring and evaluation was also on the table, along with climate risk and vulnerability assessments and photovoltaic potential assessments. These recurring themes are consistent with ongoing efforts to mainstream gender, climate resilience and disaster risk management, and energy considerations in project design. Just to give you an example, the water upgrade project in Barbados made provisions for an assessment of the gender-related impacts of frequent water outages in the most affected areas in this country. Also, renewable energy capacity will be expanded via the installation of a 550 kilowatt solar photovoltaic plant under the Bahamas Water Project. This initiative, together with a 1 megawatt solar photovoltaic pilot project in Anguilla, is indicative of the success which CDB has had with reorienting our energy focus towards sustainable energy usage. Ladies and gentlemen, I spoke about policy-based loans, and these are a key instrument in our arsenal of responses to the challenges of our countries. Policy development was a thematic area for our assistance in 2015. Our board of directors approved policy-based loans amounting to $65 million for 3 countries. Embedded in the PBLs are inter alia policy and institutional reforms to stabilize the financial sector. This is in Antigua and Barbuda. To achieve fiscal sustainability and to increase country competitiveness. They're also designed to boost growth and to build economic resilience. This is how we intervene in the policy space in our countries, because we recognize that fundamental to economic growth and development is a good policy framework. In order to encourage our borrowing member countries to adopt new technologies in areas such as renewable energy, CDB recognizes that we have to be able to source financial resources which are appropriately priced. I will explain what I mean by that. Where we see this most evident is in ventures such as geothermal energy, where there is very high upfront risk. But as you would know, there is also great opportunity because many of our OECS countries have vast geothermal potential. 3 initiatives in 2015 are worthy of special mention in this regard. First, the 21.4 billion euro Sustainable Energy for the Eastern Caribbean program, or SEEK as we call it, is being funded jointly by the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, or DFID. The European Union is also providing financing through the Caribbean Investment Facility, and CDB is pitching in some of its own resources. Secondly, the Sustainable Energy Facility, or CEF, CDB loves acronyms, for the Eastern Caribbean is a $72 million loan and grant package funded by the Inter-American Development Bank and the Caribbean Development Bank, which will benefit 6 member countries of the OECS, namely Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Both programs will allow CDB to employ innovative financing to advance sustainable energy solutions in these beneficiary countries. We will be able to expand the range of funding and of technical assistance available to both public and private sectors, placing special emphasis on solar, wind, and geothermal energy projects. The third and final initiative to which I will refer is the £300 million UK Caribbean Infrastructure Facility. Beneficiary countries will be able to access grant financing, very important in our highly indebted environment, for new infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, and port development. These projects are critical drivers of economic growth and employment creation. Let me just tell you who are the eligible countries if you haven't already heard. These are Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, Montserrat, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude my presentation by saying simply that I am guardedly optimistic about 2016. Economic recovery remains fragile, but we expect that countries will continue on an upward growth trajectory.
My statement this morning is entitled Time to Decide and will focus on the Caribbean Economic Review and our vision for Caribbean economies and the necessary policy responses as we see them. However, the presentation will begin by presenting the very important global context within which these countries operated in 2015 and the global outlook for 2016. Let me begin with the global economic outlook. 2015 was a challenging year for the global economy. Global economic growth fell from 3.4% to 3.1%. The main reason was a slowdown in China, which along with other events kept commodity prices low, impacting exporters of those products. Growth in the United Kingdom, in the United States and Canada was revised down during the year, with only the US showing higher growth than in 2014. The International Monetary Fund predicts that growth will be higher in 2016 than in 2015, with the notable exception of China. However, it should be noted that since October 2015, the IMF has revised down its growth forecast. Global forecasts will now be estimated at 3.4%, down from 3.6%, as was forecast in October 2015. There is considerable uncertainty, a toxic cocktail of downside risk, as shown by this slide. But let me focus on some of these factors influencing the global outlook. There is geopolitical uncertainty related to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or commonly known as ISIS, and there's also uncertainty associated with what's happening within Ukraine and North Korea. The markets are also uneasy since the beginning of the year. The Standard & Poor's 500 index is down by about 6%. Japan's Nikkei index is down by about 15%. Shanghai Composite Index is off by about 19%. And Germany's DAX down by approximately 7% since the beginning of the year. In China, there's a gradual slowdown and rebalancing excuse me, of economic activity away from investment and manufacturing towards consumption and services. There was tightening in monetary policy towards the end of last year in the United States. However, there is considerable uncertainty as to whether further tightening will occur in that economy, given concerns about the resilience of the US recovery. The oil price is characterized by uncertainty, with significant implications of low prices for producers' budgets and a possible boost to consumers' real income in the oil-importing countries. Possible instability in Europe, particularly caused by the possibility of a Brexit, a referendum of which is looming on June 23rd. This uncertainty has already led to a decline in the value of the pound. The Zika virus, as we've been hearing recently, is also a concern, particularly for tourist markets here in the Caribbean. If we look closer to home, the Brazilian economy is expected to contract in 2015 as well as in 2016. The effects on that country of the Zika virus constitute a further downside risk, especially given the scheduled Olympic Games. Colombia is still growing, but the IMF has revised its forecast down. There are also significant difficulties being experienced in Venezuela due to lower oil prices. Here at home, CDB's borrowing member countries, the unweighted average growth for the period 2006 to 2015 was only 1.5%. As this chart shows, this compares with the average of small island developing states, which was much higher at 3.4%. For 2015, regional economies grew by just 1%. Trinidad and Tobago, which accounts for about a third of the regional economy, if Trinidad and Tobago, which grew by only 0.2%, is removed from this equation, then the growth is a bit higher at 1.4%. But, should I dare say, nothing to shout about. But there were stellar performances from Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, and the Turks and Caicos Islands, which all grew in excess of 4%. However, as Dr. Smith mentioned earlier, low growth persists elsewhere. There were notable declines in Dominica due to Storm Erika, which impacted that country in 2015. So in this backdrop, why are Caribbean economies' growth still so low? A comparison of CDB's BMCs with other country groupings suggests that structural problems may be the obvious explanation. BMCs perform less well than other small island developing states, which suggests that size may not be the main challenge affecting regional economies. All in all, structural deficiencies in Caribbean economies remain. I will say more on this later on. As we look deeper into what is driving growth, visitor numbers were up in most of our borrowing member countries. This is good, but on its own is not good enough. In Barbados, visitor numbers grew by nearly 15%, but this translated into an increase of value added of just 0.9%, which means that tourist expenditure has stalled, along with a drop in the length of stay and a reduction in government employment. Commodity producers are feeling the negative effects of a price decrease as external accounts become negative. This chart shows what has happened to commodity prices since January 2014. So with this decline in commodity prices, government budgets have become constrained. Indeed, lower commodity prices resulted in significant external liquidity challenges for Suriname, causing a depletion of reserves and the need for a comprehensive fiscal adjustment. In Trinidad and Tobago, there was a similar impact, but healthy fiscal buffers allowed for more resilience in this instance. On the fiscal side, debt continues to be a concern, but we have had improvements with the exception of Jamaica, Grenada, and St. Kitts and Nevis. Debt increased in relation to gross domestic product in all of the BMCs in 2015. With respect to external balances, as measured by foreign exchange reserves in 2015, we saw declines in Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Haiti, Belize, and Suriname, and increases in Bahamas, the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, and Jamaica. The recommended threshold, I should say, of reserves is that it should cover 3 months of imports. All BMCs except Suriname are above this threshold. The Surinamese authorities have approached the IMF recently to discuss the possibility of IMF financial support for their economic reform program in response to the sharp fall in international commodity prices. Several important policies have already been implemented in the context of this program, with a view to strengthening the level of the international reserves and paving the way for the economy to achieve sustained growth and financial stability. Let me now say something about unemployment in the region. In the region, high levels of unemployment are still of concern. Data is scarce, but in those countries for which we have data, unemployment is in double digits in most countries. The CDB study on youth unemployment published in 2015 found that the region has some of the highest youth unemployment in the world. The study found a number of factors contributing to this, including the state of the economy, the structure of the labor market, lack of relevant skills and lack of experience, insufficient mobility, and insufficient knowledge of vacancies. To some extent, high unemployment reflects the need for greater labor market flexibility. Lack of productivity is also a major concern since it has a major impact and certainly a correlation with high per capita GDP growth. Once more, the data is scarce. The red dots in this chart are BMCs, namely St. Lucia, Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. The growth in labor productivity is low for the countries identified here, and this is highly correlated with low growth rates, which in turn we know is correlated with high unemployment levels. Within this chart, we also highlight Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Hong Kong, and Singapore as comparators for you to compare. Let me turn now to doing business in the Caribbean. So along with high levels of unemployment and low productivity, doing business is still very difficult in the Caribbean. There are only 2 BMCs in the top 80 ranked countries in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business survey. BMCs score very poorly against Singapore, the top ranked country. The survey is clear why board member countries rank where they do. Taking into account metrics such as time and cost to start a business, ease of getting construction permits, ease of trading across borders, ease of paying taxes, among others. But there are some encouraging signs. Both Jamaica and Jamaica improved their ranking. I should note that while many of our countries have tried to improve the factors that have an impact on the ease of doing business, other countries are improving faster. And CDB's 2016 research on medium, small, and micro enterprises and port infrastructure will go some way in providing appropriate policy responses to this dilemma. Along with this, logistics and transport is also an area of concern for us here. The World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, LPI for short, measures the quality of transport and logistics services based on 6 core dimensions: customs infrastructure, international shipments, logistics, competence, tracking and tracing, and timeliness. The overall average reflects the average across the 6 dimensions. The chart here shows that the Caribbean region's average score on the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index was lower than in any other region. All Caribbean countries except the Bahamas performed below the Latin American average on the LPI components. This suggests that the weak development of trade logistics might be a factor explaining poor trade performance. A CDB study on ports aims to identify ways in which they can become more efficient based on the most common metrics. This report will be published later this year in May. Initial indications are that regional ports are inefficient. For example, regional ports are spending around 65% of operating costs on labor. The generally accepted benchmark for ports of a similar size is about 50%. So, in light of all of this information that I've provided, what is CDB's outlook for our BMCs? We are forecasting growth of around just 0.3% in 2016, down from 1% in 2015, and 1.6% in 2014. Excluding Trinidad and Tobago, the forecast goes up to 1.7%, up from 1.4% in 2015. Most BMCs are expected to grow in 2016. But significantly, as Dr. Smith mentioned earlier, Trinidad and Tobago will contract, as well as Suriname. But there are risks in 2016, as we see them for our board member countries. Besides the global risk identified earlier, there is a possibility of a global economic downturn, political uncertainty in Venezuela, the risks and opportunities of continued warming US-Cuba relations. Only last week, we saw that commercial flights will resume between those countries, perhaps later this year. There's also the potential threat of the Zika virus and its impact on tourism arrivals. Commodity exporters will need to make difficult decisions about their expenditure patterns, and our research shows that tourism arrivals from the US tend to decline during the year of a US presidential election. Olympics in Rio de Janeiro could also divert tourists away from the Caribbean. The reduction in correspondent banking relationships is also a threat to financial transactions, and thus trade and remittance receipts. And in the Caribbean, the usual possibility of environmentally related events, in particular storms and hurricanes, are ever looming against our BMC economies. So I now turn to what is the Caribbean Development Bank's vision. Given this backdrop of sluggish growth, low productivity, and high unemployment, we ask, what should the vision be for our economies? We think at the Caribbean Development Bank that it is time to decide. That is to say, we need dynamic, export-oriented, competitive, inclusive, diverse, environmentally resilient economies. That is to say, it is time for us to decide. We believe that this can be achieved if we move towards private sector-led growth, an educated and flexible labor force, greater regional integration where government acts as a facilitator and efficient regulator, and sustained energy security with renewable energy and energy efficiency playing important roles. So what are some of the policy actions required to assist us in moving towards this new economy? Number one, we need a strategy that will allow us to take advantage of innovation. At the same time, we need to improve the investment climate, making it easier for the private sector to thrive. That is to say, doing business reforms. 3, labor market reforms, increase flexibility, the freedom and movement of labor, and participation and productivity at all levels. So we really need to increase the productivity of labor within our region. Human capital development, investment in quality education for all. And I need to really emphasize this. It's important that we have quality education at all levels and for all our students. And we should also have a serious emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and math, the so-called STEM subjects. Number 5, we must maintain the fiscal consolidation that has already begun in many of our countries and which we think needs to begin in some of our other borrowing member countries. This means that we should advocate for fiscal rules, increase efficiency of revenue collection and expenditure, and prioritize capital and investment and the reform of subsidies. It is also important that we improve the level of national savings to support investment and fiscal buffers. 7, although we have low fuel prices now, as indicated by the chart on what has been happening with commodity prices, we still need energy reform that will improve our energy security through the use of renewable energy and the energy mix, and greater energy efficiency for oil and non-oil producers alike. We also need a policy environment that insists micro, small, and medium enterprises, such as improved access to credit and funding. 9, targeted and affordable social protection. This is applicable to social safety nets, transfers, and subsidies. 10, maximize regional integration and take advantage of free trade agreements such as the Economic Partnership Agreement already agreed to, and try to seek out new agreements for our products and services. Number 11, improve regional transport and logistics. And here I really want to emphasize that it is very important for us to increase the efficiency of the movement of our people and goods across the region, both by air and by maritime transport. Number 12, measures required to minimize the spread of diseases. And I should end off here by saying that it is very important for us to also advocate that we need to have codes for buildings and for infrastructure so that we can build in resilience into all of our infrastructure, given the very real dangers associated with natural disasters in the region. I should end there. Thank you.
Felicia Hennis, Radio Anguilla. Dr. Smith and Dr. Ram, you spoke on correspondent banking. We know that this is a big issue for the Caribbean region. ECCB Governor, Mr. Antoine, he touched on it as well. We know the CARICOM has formed an advocacy group to lead the charge to the Congress and to dispatch a letter to the President of the United States on this matter. What role, if any, is CDB taking on this matter?
Well, if I could take the first stab at this one, we recognize it and accept it as a major threat to the attempts in the Caribbean to create economies that are more deeply integrated into the international economy. That, in our view, is the only way that we're going to be able to grow sustainably and to be able to improve the standard of living of our people. Now, CDB is not taking the lead on this matter. The lead is really being taken by the central banks, and more recently now by a number of Caribbean heads and or ministers of finance. At the recent meeting of Caribbean heads, which I attended, in the discussion on this issue, what we said was that there are a number of proposals that are being proffered at this point as to how to respond. Some of them are just concepts. Some of them are even a little bit less than that. But what we offered to do is that as these proposals emerge and become more concretized, the CDB would be prepared to use its technical assistance product to try to assess the feasibility of these response mechanisms to determine their viability. So that is the role that we would like to take. We will also use our voice, our bullet pulpit, as they say, to try to emphasize to the international community the severe damage that can be done to our borrowing members if this matter is not addressed with great urgency.
Thank you.
Marlon Madden, Barbados Today. I want to find out, I'm looking here at the chart and I realize Barbados is the only country in the region to forecast less than 1% economic growth. And this is despite a government program in place and a strong tourism forecast for this year. What's the reason? What do we need to do?
Okay. Well, Claire, well, I should say that Barbados, the forecast there, as you have correctly said, is below 1%. But there are also some other countries where the forecast is actually for growth to decline this year. Most notably, Trinidad and Tobago, the expected decline there is 2.5%. And Suriname, we expect the economy to decline by about 1%. Now, in Barbados, what we have found is that although tourism arrival numbers have increased significantly, and particularly in 2015, arrivals have increased by about almost 15%. The value added associated with this has not been as strong. And in fact, in 2015, the value added was only about 0.9%, which, as I said in my earlier statement, reflects the fact that perhaps tourists are not spending as much as they did before. And most significantly, they're not staying as long as they did before. So really there needs to be a program to get greater value added out of the tourism product. In addition to this, the government is in the midst of an austerity program. And as you would recall that in 2015 and even before that, there were some considerable layoffs within the public sector, leading to an overall decline in employment. And that is now feeding through into the economy. So we expect that to have a somewhat negative impact on growth, and hence the reason for the low growth rate forecast in 2016.
But just a follow-up, we recently implemented a number of tax measures, which the government, is expecting to rake in a lot of millions from. And I'm just wondering, why should we then only be expecting 0.9%?
Yes.
If we're supposed to be getting more revenue and we're reporting strong reserves?
Okay. Well, remember that, of course, the government has instituted some recent tax measures. Now, those tax revenues, of course, have to come from somewhere. It would be private individuals, private corporations also paying that tax. Now, it means that tax will not be utilized elsewhere in the economy for perhaps, those revenues will not be utilized elsewhere in the economy for other investment purposes. So that in fact there's a sort of a diversion of the resources away from perhaps productive uses towards the government. How the government actually decides to utilize those resources, we actually wait to see. But remember that currently the government is really into an austerity drive, and they are trying to minimize and to reduce the growth in expenditure. And so we do not expect the government to boost their expenditure significantly in 2016, although they might receive additional taxes. Remember as well that in the Barbados setting, overall the debt to GDP ratio is now quite high. And so there really needs to be a concerted effort to bring that debt to GDP ratio down so that we have a sense of stability in the policy environment. And when we actually have that sense of stability in the policy environment, we will then expect to see a boost in investment and then in time in consumption. So for 2016, yes, the forecast is a bit low, but if the government implements significant structural reforms, maintains the path towards bringing that debt to GDP ratio down, then in time we expect the policy environment to support further investment and ultimately consumption within the economy.
Deanza Roberts, Stack Network. Last year, Dr. Smith spoke of the dire in terms of the unemployment, and he said it was, of course, a major concern. And this year, it is the same thing. And you keep speaking about the lack of data or the scarcity of data. So you keep speaking about the scarcity of data, for example. What is being put in place in terms of your board member countries to really get this data so that on a yearly basis we have more accurate information in terms of the unemployment? Because it was also a concern by Dr. Smith that was raised last year about the scarcity of data as it relates to unemployment.
Okay, let me say that yes, you are correct. There's a scarcity of some data, particularly unemployment data in the region, and that reflects a real lack of labor market surveys across the region. I should say here that at the Caribbean Development Bank, we are now in the process of boosting our statistical capacity. Later this year, we will actually have a statistician on board, and we are hoping that with that boosting capacity, we will then be able to influence and to assist our board member countries in actually collecting this data on a much more frequent basis. I should also say that the Caribbean Development Bank is also working much more closely with some of our other development partners, particularly the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, USAID, and the Agency for International Development out of Canada. And we are working on a comprehensive set of reforms whereby we hope that over the next few years we'll be able to implement a really focused assessment of what are the statistical requirements within our countries. And I would say that maybe within a couple of years you would start to see a much better collection of data. So we're actually working on this. It is not something that can happen overnight, and we do understand that, but we are working towards improving that.
Nicola Barito, GSL.
Dr. Ram, improvement of the investment climate, making it easier for the private sector to thrive. When we think about Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, as you said from your stats, experiencing or expected to experience further negative growth in 2016, and when you look also at the low productivity levels, and as my colleague just mentioned, lack of data and stats, from the CDB perspective, what exactly would be the first step that we need to take in order to improve the investment climate?
Well, let me focus first of all, as you have focused on the commodity producers within the region. Both Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, as we said earlier, are expected to contract this year because, of course, the commodities that they export, the prices have fallen. What we would say is that, first of all, the fiscal balances within those countries need to be brought into balance. So right now, there is, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, the non-oil deficit is quite high. So without the oil resources, the government actually cannot finance its overall budget. And so there really needs to be a balance there. So there really needs to be a concerted effort to get that policy environment stabilized. Secondly, as I said earlier, it's important for us to understand that we need to move away from the paradigm whereby we expect governments to drive economic growth. We believe at the Caribbean Development Bank that governments should be seen as a facilitator and certainly as the regulator of economic activity, an efficient regulator. So once the government puts that environment in place, what we then expect is for the private sector to now actually step up to the plate and start actually being the driver of that growth. How will we do that? When we look across the region, we notice that it is actually still very difficult to do business within the region, certainly within Trinidad and Tobago. For many years, for commodity exporting countries, you find that policy advisors there do not tend to focus on productivity improvements because you actually have this continual stream of revenue associated with the commodity. It's a so-called Dutch disease, as it were. That actually leads to a deterioration in the overall competitiveness of other sectors of the economy. What we're saying now is that there needs to be a concerted effort to look at what are some of those competitiveness barriers for those other sectors. So if we look at manufacturing, for example, what's actually holding back the manufacturing sectors within those economies? What needs to happen? We think as well that you have to look at the overall tax burden associated on, or actually imposed on the private sector. When we compare Caribbean economies to the top-ranked economy in the world, Singapore, our tax burden for the private sector is so much higher. In fact, it's I believe in the 20s, while for Singapore, it's actually in single digits. You have to also examine how quickly it takes for you to start a business within the Caribbean. So it's not only about advocating for existing businesses. What we're saying here as well is that we need to encourage entrepreneurial activity. There are many young people with many brilliant ideas, and I know probably Dr. Smith will speak about it later on with respect to creative industries. We see that as perhaps a new growth pole here within the Caribbean. But how can we get such a sector to thrive? We have to look at the overall operating environment for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, the overall access to credit for these enterprises, because this is the actual sector that will drive employment in the future. So these are just some of the raft of measures that we think are actually necessary, and we think that we must move towards a paradigm whereby the private sector is the driver of economic growth.
Would you like me to speak to the issue of creative industries?
Thank you.
briefly?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Justin. Just to address the issue of creative industries, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody in this room that the Caribbean has a special advantage in the creative industries. We are well renowned in several different areas for music, for sport, you name it, we have it here in the Caribbean. Part of the problem is that informality has remained the bane of that industry for a long time. We have not managed to mainstream that level of economic activity, even though the principal beneficiaries, the principal drivers of that industry are likely to be our young people, who, as we have mentioned before to this audience, represent something like 35% in relation to their unemployment statistics. So that there's a lot to be had from the development of our creative industries. One of the challenges is how to finance the growth and development of this sector. The Caribbean Development Bank has been asked to address its mind to a financing mechanism for the industry. And when I speak about creative industries here, we're not just talking about the traditional music, dance, and sports. We're also talking about animation. Those of you who read your newspapers would have seen that the CDB has been collaborating with the World Bank in the development of this animation industry. Well, we are giving some thought. We are in consultation with a number of different institutions that are in the business of driving the development of the creative industries to come up with a suitable mechanism for providing appropriate financing for that industry. I don't want to say any more on it at this stage because our Vice President of Operations, she has been given the responsibility for the development of that area, and I know she's working hard on it. Come back next year and we'll give you a further update.
Thank you.
Clive Bacchus, Winner FM 90.9, Federation Media Group, St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you very much for the presentations. Two quick questions. What steps in the CDB's view are required to deepen integration as prescribed by you in terms of free movement of labor, increased productivity? And in the context of governance, are leaders and countries considering best practices, regional code perhaps? What is your take on that?
Okay. Thank you very much. With respect to integration and the greater flexibility with respect to the movement of labor, at the moment within the region, the freedom of movement of labor is restricted to certain categories of workers. And I guess in some ways that's for good reason. But I believe that in time we need to move away from that and allow the fully free movement of all types of labor across the region. If you recall from the slide that I projected earlier with respect to unemployment, you can clearly see that in some of our countries, the unemployment rate is almost in excess of 20%, and even in St. Lucia, it's in excess of about 24%. The latest figure for St. Lucia is about 24.1%. It's come down only slightly from the last time I presented that data for 2014. Now, that suggests to you, if you look across the region, you can see that there are significantly lower unemployment rates in some of our other countries, most notably currently now Trinidad and Tobago, although they are in a bit of uncertain economic climate. Cayman Islands, for example, the unemployment rate is still fairly low there. It means that there are some territories where we need more labor. More labor is required there. And if we had the full movement of labor across the region, then the excess labor that we see in some countries like St. Lucia could perhaps go to those countries. Now, we have also spoken significantly about why we need to improve transport within the region, both air and maritime. We believe that this needs to be improved. So we need to improve the efficiency in which we move people and goods around our region. This would significantly help in this regional integration process. If I could just say, it makes life a lot easier if you understand your neighbors, if you see them a lot more frequently. So we really need to get that movement of people across countries so that we get to understand our cultures a little bit more and so that we really get to understand one another. And I think if we're able to have much more efficient transport within our region, that could also help the integration process completely.
Hello, good morning. Ken BVI Beacon. You talk a lot about shifting the paradigm towards a private sector-led growth. Is that something to be achieved purely through structural reforms, or is there anything governments can do fiscally? In other words, is there any crowding out going on?
I think that the issue of crowding out is also part of the package of reforms that is necessary to drive private sector growth. In other words, if the government is running fiscal deficits such that the government has to be borrowing heavily in the domestic financial markets, money or capital, what it means is that it is ultimately going to lead to increases in interest rates, which would have the opposite effect on private initiative and private sector development. So I think that in Justin's presentation, he spoke about the doing business reforms, right, that are measured in the World Bank Index. He also spoke about the need for fiscal and debt prudence. In other words, this region has got to recognize that if it is going to grow and prosper sustainably, it has got to wrestle to the ground the twin monsters of fiscal deficit financing and debt accumulation. Those are necessary conditions. We need to recognize that if we depart from that kind of discipline, it's going to have an adverse impact on the other things that we're trying to do in order to encourage the growth of the private sector.
Thank you for that answer. Is there any appropriate level of debt to GDP or deficits to GDP in the CDB's opinion?
Certainly. We normally advocate that you should aim to have a debt to GDP ratio of 60% or less. Research has shown that once this threshold is crossed, that is to say, we have debt to GDP ratios in excess of 60% of GDP, that then tends to have a drag on economic growth, because it brings into the policy environment becomes unstable. Investors then wonder, well, what the government is likely to do to try to get that debt down. And so are there going to be new tax measures? Is there going to be greater austerity? And that brings a greater level of uncertainty. So once we have found that research has shown that 60% is that threshold. Once you cross that, then you actually bring greater instability into the system.
Thank you. When asking, would you kindly just press the button and release? Don't hold it down. Go ahead.
Yes, just to follow up on the governance issue as to what are the considerations about improving governance in the region. Perhaps is there any research being done as to what steps need to be taken immediately in the short and medium term? You're looking at different models where some countries you may have freedom of expression, freedom of information legislation, you may have integrity in public life. And the issue of quality education as well seems to be one that has to be tackled at the regional level. So in the context of governance, how do you see this moving forward?
You mentioned education?
In terms of quality education.
Quality of education.
Yes.
Well, maybe I can just have a stab at that. Some years ago, the CDB recognized that the issue of education, broadly defined, is a space that was in great need of support, so that we have shifted our emphasis very much in that direction. Justin, in his presentation, spoke about the need for the emphasis on appropriately targeted education, and he mentioned the need for emphasis on the STEM subjects. We in this region have spent a lot of money educating our people. In the early years, the emphasis was in quantity. There was a quantitative thrust, so we measured what percentage of our population was being covered in primary or secondary and even in tertiary education. These days, and it was reflected in the Caribbean-specific Millennium Development Goals, which CDB helped to develop. What we did is we sought to shift the focus on the quality of the education being provided. Not only quality, but appropriateness. In other words, it must be suited to the market. It's a misallocation, in my view, of resources if we continue to produce educated people and there is no market available for them. So that the targeting of education must be twinned with the improvement in the quality of education. We need to have a labor force that is available, that can be employed, even as we try to drive the development of our private sector. We see several examples of this across our region, where the investment promotional entities are going out there trying to bring investors into the country. But as the investors look more closely at what we have to offer, one of the big constraints that emerges is the inappropriateness or insufficient quality of the labor force that we have to offer. So it's a huge, huge issue, and it is one that the CDB is giving emphasis to as we work with our countries. In my presentation, you perhaps heard quite a bit of reference to technical and vocational education. That is part of the thrust that we are focusing on.
Yes, my name is Jules Vasquez from 7 News Belize. If I could, Dr. Ram, you spoke about the 2 years I've been here, you spoke about the ease of doing business survey, and only 2 countries, I believe, went up this year in the Caribbean. Isn't, first, a large issue within that the lack of correspondent banking relationships and the increasing difficulty in establishing bank accounts for foreigners because of the AML, CTF regulations in the United States? That's first. And second, how do you see this within the wider context of north-south advantage taking, insofar as we know that Caribbean countries are being persecuted out of the services sector? It's real. The offshore banking, so many countries in the region have been hectored and harassed out of it. So how do you view those things, both as a fetter on doing business for foreign investors who have a very hard time setting up bank accounts because of all the strict regulations, and second, within the wider global context?
Okay. Well, first of all, the threat associated with the decline in correspondent banking in the region is real, and it's likely to have quite a negative impact on our trade relations also with respect to remittances coming from external countries back to the Caribbean. As Dr. Smith mentioned, we think that this really needs to be dealt with. It's quite unfortunate that it's being dealt with in a sort of a blanket approach by some of our northern neighbors. It's unfortunate because really it should have been dealt with in a sort of a risk-based approach. How risky are some of these transactions within the Caribbean as it relates to some of these activities that they are trying to actually put a brake on? Now you have to understand what's the threat that they are actually trying to succumb or to actually suppress. It's related to terrorism-related activity as well as to money laundering. I think that what really needs to happen is that we need to have a dialogue, perhaps at the political level, between our leaders here in the Caribbean and those with our major trading partners, particularly in the United States. So I mean that at this point in time, some of the measures that are being touted as being what can actually be utilized to alleviate this problem with respect to correspondent banking, as Dr. Smith mentioned, perhaps central banks stepping in. But that might not be efficient. What really needs to happen is a policy dialogue so that we could probably have a greater risk-based approach to this. Because without that dialogue and what we currently have in place, it's actually going to be a real stifle on economic activity. Could you imagine private sectors trying to operate within the Caribbean and they can't actually get paid or they can't actually get their funds out of the region? That's going to be a real hindrance to economic growth eventually. And it is something that I believe we need to work on right now. We need to have a solution to it. We cannot wait. And we need to have an effective solution to it. So you're absolutely right. This threat associated with correspondent banking will have a major negative impact on investment activity and economic growth within the region unless we deal with it effectively now.
If I could just add to what Justin is saying here. This one is a real conundrum for us here in the Caribbean. Because ironically, one of the things that we heard at the recent CARICOM heads discussion was that in the initial interface between some of our Caribbean leaders and central bankers and the authorities in the United States, what they are saying is that the Caribbean in general is compliant. In other words, we are not in violation of the anti-money laundering or the CFT regulations. So in part, what is emerging here is that there is risk from different parts of the world, not just from the Caribbean. Part of the challenge is that there are going to be fines now. Well, there are fines now that will be imposed on entities that are found to have facilitated the transfer of monies that might be traced back to either money laundering or terrorist financing. So that the banks here in the region could well find themselves in a position where they face heavy fines, which then raises the question about their own viability as business entities because of the nature of those fines. That is part of the conundrum that we face. It is really, really a very thorny one, and how we resolve it is something that's going to require not only focusing of some very, very good minds, but also some creative solutions at the end of the day. A number of things were on the table at the recent meeting of CARICOM heads. And, you know, this is something that we need to continue to look at and to inform the media generally in relation to progress. Because Justin is absolutely right. This is a major threat hanging over our heads, even at a time when we are saying that the solution for our countries as far as economic development is concerned is deeper integration and penetration into international markets. How do you do that if you can't move money back and forth from our countries to their trading partners and vice versa?
Then if I may, a quick follow-up. You spoke about the forecast for the region, and you mentioned in there one of the uncertainties was Cuba. How much of a factor might Cuba be, since the liberalization and the regularization of flights is very recent? Might that projection for regional growth have to be tapered down if we already see that in Barbados, tourists are spending less, which may be an aspect of cruise tourism versus overnight, which is a whole other conversation, as we know. But how might your projections have to be refigured depending on what happens with Cuba, because it's a constantly evolving situation between the US and Cuba?
Sure. Well, in 2016, I don't think we would need to adjust our figures significantly, perhaps from 2017 or so. Why do I say that? Direct flights between the US and Cuba, and that is to say commercial flights, will not begin maybe until September, October, so into the fourth quarter of this year. So not likely to have a real significant impact as yet on other Caribbean destinations. But let me say this, I have identified this warming between US and Cuba both as an opportunity and a threat. And I really think that we need to focus more on it being an opportunity as well. What you really need to do, and the recent estimates are that when those commercial flights begin between the US and Cuba, it's likely to be about 110 per day, 20 alone to Havana, and then the rest to other international airports within Cuba. Now, if we could actually have greater airlift between Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean, we could probably entice tourists who are actually thinking of going to Cuba to then perhaps lengthen their stay within the rest of the Caribbean and visit other tourism destinations within our board member countries. Perhaps going to the north coast of Jamaica, let's say, or then over to Turks and Caicos. That's just to give you an indication of what is possible. So I think really for us here in the Caribbean, we have to see what are the opportunities and try to see how we can perhaps deepen perhaps our integration with Cuba within the near future.
I would just like to add that we need to change our mindset here in the Caribbean. For some time, and I think the attitude is changing, there has been a negative view of competition. We're afraid of competition. In my view, competition helps to drive innovation, and it also helps to drive efficiency. If we take the stance that Justin mentioned here of recognizing opportunity on the introduction of Cuba into the Caribbean tourism market, I think we will have a very different view as to how we should develop and transform our own tourism industries. We have a lot to offer here. The Cubans do also. They have a different type of tourism product. But we have not sufficiently optimized the development of our tourism. We are still very much, in many respects, tied to sea, sun, and sand. And that needs to change. We need to emphasize the heritage aspect, which is where Cuba is going to be very, very powerful. They have tremendous heritage. They also have tremendous creative industry, their music and their dance, but so do we. But we don't offer enough of it to our visitors. So that this, in fact, could turn out to be the stimulus, the impetus, if you will, that we need to be able to develop our industries such that we can earn more for our people. So every time I hear this talk about Cuba and the threat, I think, how can we turn that setback into an advance? And that is how I would like to see us think about Cuban tourism.
Thank you, Desmond. I recognize you, but just to get a question in from one of our online viewers, Andre Charles wants to know, are there any plans for the CDB to specifically help regional commodity exporters, such as Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, diversify their economies, implement policy reforms, and return to sustainable growth? Dr. Ram, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Thank you very much, Cleo. Well, at this point in time, we are poised to actually assist Suriname. As I mentioned earlier, the Surinamese authorities have approached the International Monetary Fund to assist them with a structural adjustment program that will help bring their fiscal accounts back into balance and then set them off on a track towards sustainable economic growth. To do so would require a number of structural reforms, including, as we've spoken earlier, about this ease of doing business. Those reforms are going to be very, very important over the next couple of years for Suriname. Why is that important? Because we understand that in economies such as Trinidad and Tobago and in Suriname, that they need to diversify their export base, find other ways of generating foreign exchange. So the Caribbean Development Bank will be supporting Suriname this year through the policy-based loan, as Dr. Smith has mentioned, and we will be supporting a number of reforms, not only this year, but also next year, as we seek to assist Suriname come out of this particular predicament that they find themselves in and set them on a course to sustainable economic growth. That will, in the end, we hope, be private sector driven and lead them to a much more dynamic, export-oriented economy.
Thank you. Desmond, please.
Thank you, Cleo. I have two questions. Given that Antigua and Barbuda has been a good client of the CDE over the years, and with the fiscal tightening that the current administration has implemented, coupled with last year's economic growth trends of approximately 3% and the projected growth for 2016 being suggested to be over 5%, will it be more difficult for Antigua and Barbuda to be able to access grant funding to improve much of its physical infrastructure in light of the several high-end projects that are due to come on stream?
Grant funding, that's perhaps the scarcest form of financing that you'll find anywhere in the world. Antigua and Barbuda have sort of slipped under the fence as far as the UK CIF is concerned. What it means, however, is that because of imminent graduation for Antigua and Barbuda, that they will have to utilize their share of the CIF money before the end of this year. We are going to be working closely with the government of Antigua to ensure that they find the appropriate pipeline to be able to move those resources. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, Mr. Director of Projects, but I know that that is our intent. But just to answer your question shortly, Antigua and Barbuda, because of their level of per capita income, falls into that category of countries which don't readily benefit from grant resources.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
Yes, another
Go
question.
ahead.
The Citizenship by Investment program, as is being practiced by some Caribbean countries, and in particular Antigua and Barbuda, has provided much non-tax revenue to aid several developmental areas and to reduce outstanding debts. In the context of the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union and the centrality of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, is there a more definitive and possibly functional role that can be practically played by the CDB in terms of providing technical and oversight facilities for the furtherance of the sustainability of such programs as a means of strengthening integrated development? And relatedly, and in terms of grant and other assistance that comes from the CDB, would it mean that the success for such countries on the CIP program put them in a situation of graduation from fairly easy access to CDB funds and other forms of assistance?
Let me just have a crack at that one. My own personal view is that citizenship by investment is a legitimate area of activity for Caribbean countries to be involved in. Most countries in the world have citizenship by investment type programs. The challenge for small countries in this business, however, is because of the complexities of the due diligence that's required to ensure that you don't become part and parcel of international criminal networks and what have you, is small countries don't have access, as easy access, if you will, to the types of investigatory and due diligence mechanisms that larger countries would have. It doesn't mean, however, that it is not possible for countries of our size to be able to develop relationships that would enable them to be able to access that information. We have had informal discussions with some of our borrowing member countries who are either currently active in or are desirous of getting involved in this kind of business. And the nature of the discussions has been precisely along the lines which you have intimated. Technical assistance to help them to get an understanding of what they need to do. What are the critical factors that they need to address? What are the mechanisms and the linkages that they need to develop in order for them to operate effectively in that space without getting themselves into difficulties, as has happened from time to time with some of our countries?
Thank you.
Just to get back to the issue of youth unemployment in the region, you mentioned access to microfinancing, you mentioned high-quality education. How do you finance those? What model do you use to increase access to finance for young people? And how do you pay for the quality education that some people would like to access but can't afford?
Financing for private sector, small business?
When you speak to a lot of young people, they have ambition, but they keep saying they can't access money.
Okay, yeah, yes, that is the area that needs much greater emphasis and attention at this point in time, because CDB has been financing private sector activity for perhaps as long as it has been around. What we are recognizing now is that what emerging entrepreneurs need is equity capital, seed capital, the various types of words that are used to describe venture capital. That again has not in the past been our core business. But it is something that we are looking at, and I am very reluctant to put my Vice President of Operations on the line, but these are some of the things that we're having to look at, even as we recognize the need to address that space. CDB does have some amount of financing that can be used for the purpose of seed capital. It's not a whole lot. But then again, if you're talking about small business, especially micro, they don't need a whole lot of this type of money. What we have to do, in my judgment, is to play a role in crowding in, to use this fancy new term, crowding in some of that type of money into instruments that we would participate in. And that is one of the things that we are also looking at. The business of credit enhancement is also an area where I think that CDB can be effective. It doesn't provide equity or venture capital type financing, but what it will do is it would encourage institutions that lend to micro and small enterprises. It would encourage them to be more inclined to engage with those types of entrepreneurs, because CDB would provide some kind of a fallback. In other words, we would be prepared to take on some of the risk or remove some of the risk from them to encourage them to make the investments. I say this against the background that in many of our countries, there's no shortage of liquidity in the financial sector, in the banking system. But those institutions are reluctant, understandably, to use that liquidity in order to engage in a segment of the market that is especially risky. Well, that's where institutions like us step up. That is an area of what you might call market failure. And multilateral institutions, part of our remit is to address market failure.
Okay. Could I also just say something on that as well? At CDB, we're also doing major research on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and that research will be published in May of this year. And that research is looking not only at the access to finance for these types of enterprises, but also the overall business environment for them. And as Dr. Smith has mentioned, if we can ensure that the majority of these enterprises can actually be viable. Once that happens, then that really opens up a slew of opportunities with respect to financing. It becomes much more easier for financial houses to provide financing for them if they see these types of enterprises as being actually legitimate and viable over the medium to long term. So I would suggest we look out for this piece of research. That's going to be published in May, and within that we expect to have a number of conclusions as to what needs to happen to ensure that MSMEs are viable. Because MSMEs, when we really look at it, are the engines of employment within the region. And so we see that as that sector as being really important for us if we want to bring down those high levels of unemployment across the region.
Thank you. You had another question? All right.
Dr. Smith, I want to take it back to human capital development. And I remember in the 2015, at the 2015 presser, we spoke about how important that is, and we are looking at that as well in 2016. But coming out of 2015 and at this present time, have we seen any major developments or development projects, re-quality education that we can talk about? And do we have any in the pipeline at this time? And also, Dr. Ram, I know at present at the Trinidad Hilton, there's a regional consultation on advancing the Caribbean Corporation in health benefit for the regional good. And when we look at the impact of, or the possible negative impact that the Zika virus could have on Caribbean tourism, what advice is the CDB giving to those territories or those countries that are tourism-driven, given the very negative impact it could have on the bottom line?
Well, if I could start with the education-related question. I would be speaking from memory if I were to tell you about the large number of education-related projects that CDB has been engaged in over the last few years. I did mention in my presentation some that we approved in 2015. One was in Belize, the other one Grenada. One was in Grenada, and in St. Kitts Nevis. And in 2014, our first loan to Suriname was a loan for technical and vocational education. So that's just a sampling. And you notice the heavy emphasis on technical and vocational, because in many respects what has happened is in many of our countries we have already reached a stage where we have achieved at least the targets in relation to numbers in our school systems. Where the emphasis now has to focus on is areas like curriculum development, things of that nature. But rest assured that if you need the exact information, we can provide it before you leave here on the work that we have been doing in education. And it's only going to get more plentiful, because we recognize that our region will not be able to compete if we do not solve that problem. Let me just add, sorry, Cleo, if you don't mind. One of the areas that is very close to my heart is using technology to try to democratize the delivery of education. Both within country and across the region, there is too much variability in the quality of the education delivery that we provide in the Caribbean. My vision personally would be that if you have a top-class physics teacher in a high school somewhere in Georgetown, Guyana, that physics teacher could be educating in real time a student studying physics in Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, or wherever, utilizing the technology. It is not technology of the future, it is technology of today. But what we need to do is to make the investment so that what we do is remove the discriminatory delivery of education that is putting us in a position that diminishes our ability to compete in the international economic space. So that is part of my vision. I know that in the CDB, we have already provided financing to the University of the West Indies for them to introduce that type of thing through what is called the Single Virtual University Space Project. That's something that's in development, and it does precisely that. It allows a student at Mona to be able to access in real time a course that's being delivered at St. Augustine or Cave Hill or wherever in the system. It also is the mechanism through which the open campus is going to allow the OECS countries to more efficiently, but with equality, access coursework from the main campuses of the University of the West Indies.
Thank you, Barbados Today. You had another question? Go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, in your presentation, you mentioned that the CDB gave out, I think, over 120 million in loan to Barbados and another country as it relates to water distribution and infrastructure. We're currently having a drought situation in Barbados and other Caribbean islands. And here specifically, some areas, St. Joseph and some East Coast parishes, they're experiencing some troubles or difficulties in getting water. Are there any concerns from the CDB as it relates to these issues that we're facing?
Well, I don't know if the question would be, the response would be concerns. Yes, I think there's a general recognition that with climate change and the impact of climate change, the region generally is going to have water challenges. Several of our Caribbean countries, including Barbados, are water deficit countries, and that requires a response. We can't live without water. We have to have water not only for domestic and human consumption, we also need it for business. So that the intervention that's taking place here in Barbados, and I'll ask Daniel Best, if you don't mind, Daniel, to just speak a little bit to the Barbados intervention, because I think it's an important one. You might also want to speak, Daniel, about the intervention in the Bahamas. That one has a nice little twist to it, because we're also integrating, I think we're integrating renewable energy in that one. So with your permission, ladies and gentlemen, I'll ask Daniel Best, our Director of Projects, to speak to those.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for the question. With respect to the Barbados initiative, absolutely we're well aware of the current challenges faced with many sections of the country with respect to water shortages. And along with building into our project improvements with respect to distribution and transmission, we have also considered the age of much of the plant within the country, which is a challenge and has resulted in many of the shortages. So issues of storage and capacity, and as the President would have spoken to, with the effects of climate variability and change, we are seeing extended periods of drought. I would also like to particularly touch on the issue of non-revenue water, which is of major concern to Barbados and which we're dealing with in a very holistic way under that particular initiative. So we have invested, or will be investing through the Barbados Water Authority, of course, equipment in terms of leak detection equipment, and also training for staff to reduce the high preponderance of non-revenue water, which is currently experienced in Barbados. With respect to the Bahamas intervention, there's a challenge, of course, as the President mentioned. Bahamas also is a water scarce territory, and as there's therefore a challenge with sourcing of water for many of these sections of the country. And as a result, there's a study built into that project to consider alternative sources of water, but also how the water is actually distributed. Energy consumption is a major challenge for many of our water resource agencies across the region. And so we were quite pleased to build into that project some renewable energy initiatives with respect to the photovoltaic plant, which will be built into to the Bahamas Water Services infrastructure to aid in the delivery of water to consumers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have a question, another online question from Charmaine Wright. Many Caribbean nations are struggling with modernizing their justice sector. Is the CDB inclined to support those efforts? Dr. Smith?
Let me say that the CDB has facilitated the improvement in our justice system regionally. Even though that project perhaps was not classified under that rubric. We did provide the financing for the development of the Caribbean Court of Justice, but CDB is not directly in the area of justice development. I know that there are other development partners. Canada in particular has played a very, very key role in that area. And I think one of the things that the questioner would appreciate is that CDB cannot be involved in everything. We're a small institution. We need to focus. If we try to be all things to all people, we won't be as effective as we can. So that as long as an area is well served, and as long as CDB does not have any special expertise in that area, we're quite happy for our development partners, such as Canada and the UK and others, to assist in the development of sectors which are as critical as others, such as the justice sector.
Thank you. Just two more questions before we wrap up. Go ahead, please.
Ryan Broom, CBC News, Barbados. This question relates to economic reform, and either Dr. Ram or Dr. Smith can answer. I see Antigua has removed personal income taxes as part of their program. I'm trying to find out from you if you think this is an approach that could be a one-size-fits-all that we can use in Caribbean. Obviously, other taxes go up as well. But is there some sense in this for us to use throughout the region, this approach in removing personal income taxes?
I am not bright enough to answer that question, so I'm going to happily hand it over to my Director of Economics.
Sure. Okay, the removal of personal income tax. Let me just say, what we are advocating here at the Caribbean Development Bank is that we have sustainable fiscal balances. That means that governments need to efficiently collect revenue, and they need to be very prudent in the way that they spend those revenues and target that expenditure on where it is most required. For some territories, it might be prudent for them to remove or reduce some levels of taxes. That could be personal, that could be others. I'm not going to say that the removal of personal income tax is a one-size-that-fits-all across the region. Certainly, I don't think that we should be advocating that. But what I really want to advocate here is that governments need to focus on efficient collection of revenues, and those includes tax and non-tax revenues, and look at prudent expenditure of those revenues, targeted where governments and where society can get the best bang for their buck. Remember that we're advocating for fiscal consolidation and the reduction in overall debt to GDP ratios. And why is that important? Because we believe that that will provide a policy environment that brings stability and will in turn lead to an environment that encourages greater private sector investment and definitely private sector-led growth over the medium to long term.
Thank you.
Dr. Ram, I realize you did not
get a chance to redo this again. The question re tourism in the Caribbean, the threat of the Zika virus and CDB's advice
yes.
to those particular types.
Okay, sure. You would remember, thank you for coming back to me with that question. You remember that I spoke about decide, and the last letter there, E, really focuses on environmental resilience, and that includes, of course, health risk. And of course, there was an earlier question about, with respect to drought that we might be experiencing in some of the territories within the Caribbean. environmental resilience is particularly important for us. Now, it goes much broader than just health and, of course, drought. If you really think about our economies here in the Caribbean, we really are all dependent on natural endowments. And so we really need to protect our natural environment. And if we're thinking about protecting our natural environment, it means that we need to be very careful about external threats to that environment, including climate change and the threats associated perhaps with disease. Now, with respect to Zika, that is a particularly important threat at this point in time. It's different from the other mosquito-borne diseases because now it's coming with the possibility that it could actually be related to this microcephaly associated with childbirth. And of course, for anyone traveling to a destination where you think that you could actually get Zika virus, you would not travel, particularly if women are thinking of becoming pregnant or if they're not pregnant already. But that then means that we need to have a concerted effort. What is required? Just thinking about it at the surface. For aircraft, vessels coming from outside the region to the region, we need to ensure that these aircraft cabins are sprayed. I can tell you that coming back to the region recently from outside, from other countries, that is not happening. Why is that? If we have such a threat, we need to be actually acting very, very quickly to ensure that that threat doesn't reach us here. And of course, there needs to be a much more comprehensive approach to it, and governments across the region need to come together to ensure that this particular threat does not materialize in a way that could really hamper economic growth within our region, as that threat actually is. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Is there anyone who did not yet ask a question with a burning question? Please.
Shyla Esprit from Dominica Chronicle. CDB has been very involved in Dominica's recovery and rebuilding efforts in the months following Tropical Storm Erica. And Dr. Smith spoke earlier about building resilience as one of the areas that the CDB considers when it's looking at renewable energy or energy design, project designs. I'm really interested in hearing more details about how involved the CDB is as far as governance and regulation in terms of its funding of projects for rebuilding efforts or for any new energy-related project designs, because Dr. Ram was just explaining how careful we have to be in terms of our attention to our natural endowments. I think I would like to hear more from both of you probably on the necessity or the critical nature of the building resilience and the measures taken to make sure that our construction sector is being very aware of that. So how can you speak more detail about the construction sector particularly and addressing sustainability?
Well, I'm going to ask Daniel Best to come in again, because he was actually one of our engineers, one of our colleagues who was in Dominica, I think, within a few days of the most recent tropical storm damage. But Dominica is one of the most beautiful countries in the Caribbean, but Dominica also finds itself in a position where it is perhaps one of the most vulnerable because of its natural endowments. So that Dominica is, in many respects, a good test case for not only us, but for other donors as to how to build resilience against the damage that can be caused by climate change. So we have real-life experience of having gone into Dominica. And Daniel, if you could just speak not only to what we have done recently in Dominica, but if you could also speak to how we are working with the government of Dominica to ensure that we mitigate against the problem of building infrastructure today, and then next year it's damaged and destroyed by the ravages of climate change. Daniel?
Thank you again, Mr. President. Thank you for the question. I was, as the President would have alluded to, I led a team into Dominica almost immediately following the passage of Tropical Storm Erica. And certainly what the team was, I think he said we were all significantly impacted by what we saw in Dominica. And hence, in designing CDB's interventions and initiative under our disaster management strategy and operational guidelines, using the instruments available to us, the rehabilitation and reconstruction loan effort, which we would have, which our board would have approved for Dominica subsequently, the designs for the interventions there, particularly in the Layu area, for instance, would have considered climate variability and change in a very real way with respect to the engineering designs. And I'm speaking specifically with respect to the return period for the flood events. What we saw, particularly in the Layu area, what would have been rivers and water courses which would have previously been designed for 1 in 50-year period storm events being totally decimated, brought in very stark and real terms, certainly to the engineers on the team, and of course there were other multilateral development partners there as well, the need to consider certainly longer return periods and intensity of runoff for storm events during very compressed time periods, which was what occurred during Tropical Storm Erica. I would like to perhaps also touch on, it's not just for that particular rehabilitation and reconstruction effort, but for the other interventions which we're funding in Dominica. I'm speaking particularly about the water sector, where we now have had to relook at the passage and the routing of transmission pipelines, which were all destroyed. So this level of detail and design is what we are considering in a very active way and a very real way as an institution. I would also like to, if I may be allowed, Mr. President, speak about the climate action line of credit, which CDB facilitates and which has been extended to us through the European Union. And under that facility, in all of the interventions financed under that facility, we undertake climate vulnerability assessments in our designs. So essentially, what we're doing as a projects department and as a bank, we're no longer considering just the standard engineering designs, which we would have done maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But we're considering the incremental changes that our region is experiencing as a result of the variability in our weather patterns in the design and designing accordingly. So or transit corridors, for instance, in considering, and I don't want to get into too much engineering details, but in considering base course, lift, turning radius, these kind of things, line of sight, we are taking the full gamut of our project designs and running them through the lens of climate variability and change. And I spoke about earlier the water sector and non-revenue water, but we're also considering the impacts on gender, because climate variability and change and the horrific effects it has on our infrastructure impacts men and women in different ways. And so how we treat with the design of our project initiatives, we're looking at it from a more complex, if you will, lens to fulfill our mandate to our board member countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for being so engaged.